Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. This episode is about tropical deforestation. When we think about tropical forests, we often think about the forest primeval, wilderness untouched by human hands, chock-a-block with biodiversity. In fact, many forests have had people living in them for centuries or even millennia. That includes the greatest tropical forest of the world in the Amazon basin of South America. This is one of the people who lives in the Amazon basin in that forest. Her name is Dona Rosario, and she was visited by my friend Charles Mann a few years ago, who took these pictures in her house. This is her front porch looking out onto the forest. This is her kitchen. This is her cistern where she collects rainwater for drinking. And this is her land. And the trees on her land include many trees that Dona Rosario herself has planted. Yep, planted. Trees in the tropical rainforest actually planted by human beings. And in the local markets in the nearest city, Belém, you can find forest tree seeds for sale and seedlings. And people buy those things and they plant them in the forest. And in doing so, they're planting trees that they find particularly important for their own livelihoods. Trees that provide fruit, trees that provide fiber, trees that provide medicinal bark or leaves that can be used in traditional healing, trees that provide building materials, trees that provide good habitat for other species that are important in people's livelihoods. When you look out the front of Dona Rosario's house across the little tributary outside her house, this is what you see. And you might look at it and say, wow, there's the forest primeval. But when Dona Rosario looks at it, this is what she sees. Each of those trees has a name. She knows what they are. She planted some of them. Other ones grew naturally, and she allowed them to grow, in effect weeding the forest, making space for them, as opposed to other plants. And so you have things like acai, the fruit that's become very popular now in U.S. markets, kind of a miracle fruit, it's thought of, lots of great antioxidants. That's one of the trees that grows across from her. You have lemon trees, you have other kinds, mango trees, you have trees that provide food for fish. You have all kinds of plants growing there. And what you've got really is what you might think of as an anthropogenic forest, a forest that has been shaped by an interaction between humans and nature over the centuries or even longer. When we think about why forest cover is being lost in many tropical and subtropical regions of the world, there are three main causes, three main drivers. The most important in the Amazon and in much of Latin America is conversion of land to cattle ranching. That's the number one driver of deforestation in that part of the world. In other parts of the world, number one is logging, extraction of trees from the forest for often international markets. And that's been the primary driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia, in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. And a third driver is agribusiness, the conversion of land into cropland, the removal of the trees, the burning of the trees, and planting the land with things like soybeans in Brazil or palm oil. And usually that agribusiness is done, as the name suggests, by big firms, and again, often oriented towards export markets. The costs of tropical deforestation include cost to the local people, loss of livelihoods for people like Dona Rosario who depend on the forest for their livings. It includes costs that are localized but not necessarily just on the people living in the forest, but also people living nearby, especially people living downstream in hilly areas that are being deforested. And those costs include increased flood risk during the rainy season, as the hydrological sponge effect, as it's called, the ability of the forest to hold water during the rainy season is destroyed. As the forest is destroyed and the water just runs off downstream. It includes increased drought during the dry season, because the destruction of that hydrological sponge effect also means that you're not releasing that water slowly after the rainy season stops, but instead it all ran down during the floods in the rainy season. It includes soil erosion, both by heavy rains on barren land in the rainy season and also by winds, particularly in dry season. And it includes the loss of biodiversity. The tropical forests are exceptionally rich in biodiversity. I mean exceptionally rich. Some years ago, a study was done on a single mountain in the Philippines, and they counted all the woody plant species they could find there, the trees and shrubs. And they identified more species on one mountainside, called Mount Makiling, than in the entire lower 48 states of the US. So we're talking about really rich biodiversity in many of these forests. And also, you lose the carbon sequestration that the forest provides. A lot of carbon is held in the biomass of the forest, and while burning fossil fuels, returning carbon that was taken out of the air millions of years ago and stored under the ground is the main reason for global climate destabilization. A secondary and important reason has been deforestation, and particularly tropical deforestation. Those costs then include local costs to the people living in the forests, regional costs to the people affected nearby, and global costs. And so you've got different parties that are negatively impacted by deforestation. And on the other hand, you've got the folks who benefit from deforestation, notably the cattle ranchers, the loggers, and the agribusiness firms. Some of those benefits are passed on to consumers. Consumers get cheaper meat, cheaper wood, cheaper soybeans, etc. And so sometimes people have talked about the hamburger connection. The cattle ranch conversion of forests in Latin America has increased the supply of beef on world markets, and as a result, the price of a hamburger in the United States is a little bit lower. I mean by a little bit, about 1 cent per burger, not a lot, but a little bit lower than it would otherwise be. And so that's a benefit passed on to consumers. And while 1 cent on a hamburger doesn't sound like much, there are billions and billions of hamburgers sold in the United States, and that 1 cent adds up. And so there's some of the benefit from deforestation going to consumers as well as to the people actually engaged in the deforestation. But an important thing to remember about the people engaged in it is that in general, they're not poor people. I mean, of course, you may have poor people who are working for the cattle ranchers clearing the land, working for the logging companies, etc. But we're not talking here much about small farmers or poor people moving into the forest because they're desperate to make a living and they don't have land anywhere. No, that's not the big deal. Think about this. Most of the forests are publicly owned, or at least nominally publicly owned, and to get access to those forests, to log them or to convert them into private lands for ranching or for agribusiness, you need some political clout, you need some political power. And poor folks don't have that power typically. You're talking about relatively powerful people who are organizing the deforestation. So the image that poor babies are destroying the rainforest, which has been propagated to some extent in countries like the United States, partly as a way of drumming up fear about the so-called population explosion, is pretty misplaced, because what we really ought to be worrying about is the activities of cattle ranchers, logging industry, and agribusinesses that are driving this process forward. One of the interesting ways to protect the forest that's been pioneered in Brazil is the development of what are called extractive reserves. And I want to end by talking a little bit about how that happened. So extractive reserves are a kind of protected area, but they're different from the sort of protected area that you sometimes hear about, which involves basically putting a fence around a chunk of nature and trying to keep people out of it, including keeping out people who might have lived there or might have harvested plants or animals there in the past, who get transformed into people who are described as squatters or trespassers. The extractive reserves are different. They recognize that there are people who've made their livings for a long time through the forest, through harvesting forest products, and have done so in a sustainable way. And indeed, like Dona Rosario, some of these folks have actually helped to create the forests and maintain the forests. And instead of kicking them out, they're allowed to continue their extractive activities in the forest. They have the right to do so, but what is not allowed is the deforestation process that would destroy their livelihoods and destroy the forest in the bargain. This picture on the screen is of a rubber tapper, what they call in Portuguese a seringueiro, who is extracting latex from rubber trees that grow in the forest, and scratching the bark of the tree doesn't hurt it. It's kind of like collecting maple syrup here in New England where I live. And that's how he and his family mainly make their living. And they can keep doing that sustainably year after year and generation after generation. And they were among the people who were hit hardest by deforestation by ranchers as that activity was spreading deeper and deeper into the Amazon. The leader of the rubber tappers in the state of Acre in Brazil was this man, Chico Mendes, who tried to organize the rubber tappers to fight against deforestation, and did so in the face of threats from the cattle ranchers, and indeed paid the ultimate price in the end because he was assassinated by cattle ranchers back in 1988. But before that happened, Chico did something really important, which is he helped to forge an alliance between the local extractivists, the rubber tappers and other indigenous communities living in the forest, dependent on the forest, who were fighting deforestation, and international environmental activists and advocates who were also trying to fight deforestation because they were worried about the loss of biodiversity. They were worried about the loss of carbon sequestration in the tropical forests around the world. And so Chico went to Washington, D.C., and he was taken around by environmental groups to meet senators and others to explain what was going on down in Brazil and to argue that they ought to try to do something about it. And in particular, they ought to press the Inter-American Development Bank, which was lending money to Brazil for the construction of roads that allowed this cattle ranching activity to expand and the cattle, the beef, to get out onto world markets from deep in the Amazon. He insisted that the bank ought to try to prevent this kind of deforestation as a condition for its loans to the government of Brazil. Like I say, the ranchers didn't appreciate that, and in the end, Chico paid for his effective advocacy with his life. But the alliance that he forged gradually shifted the balance of power between those who benefit from deforestation and those who are harmed by it. The balance of power kind of changed as the heavy weight in favor of the ranchers, when they were only opposed by the local extractivists, by the rubber tappers, or when they were only imposed by the international environmentalists. That balance began to change when the extractivists and the environmentalists came together. And together, they were able to shift the balance of power and gradually create the conditions that led to the creation of Brazil's extractive reserves. And that's an example of the operation of something that we've called the power-weighted social decision rule. Before the alliance was forged, the balance of power between the ranchers on the one hand and the opponents of deforestation, the local folks and the international environmentalists, looks something like this. So here's the benefit to the ranchers. As you deforest more, their marginal benefit goes down, and it's weighted by the power of those ranchers, their power to influence government policy, international lending organization policies, etc. And here's the cost to the indigenous people and to the world environment, weighted by the power of the folks who bear those harms. And the level of activity you ended up reflected the balance not only of benefits and costs, but of power between the two opposed sides, those on the winning side and those on the losing side from deforestation. And one way to think about what happened as a result of that alliance was that the voice of those adversely affected, the voice of the extractivists and those worried about the environmental costs of deforestation in the Amazon, went up. Their voice became louder. Those costs became more visible to policymakers and others, to the public as well. In other words, their power increased because they were working together, because they'd forged this alliance. And so after the alliance was formed, you had a shift in the balance of power, in the power-weighted costs and benefits, and you ended up with less deforestation than you had before. Like the future of the planet, at the end of the day, the future of the forests in places like Brazil and around the world really depends on all of us. And it depends on our ability to make common cause across countries, across class, across race and ethnicity, among those who understand that protecting the forests is a good thing, not only for future generations, but for people here today. Thanks very much.